Hello, welcome back to the GM's Guide. I'm your host, Dan Felder, your kind and merciful GM. Today, we are joined once again by our guest, Gabe. So, Gabe is my friend from last time where we talked about lore dungeons, and we are gathering together to talk about something that I think we hinted about last time, which was the Disney World campaign that we both ran. This was the first time we had co-GM together. Gabe had played a bunch of my games, he'd helped me with a lot of my settings, but we finally worked together to co-GM a mini-campaign arc. So, it was 5 episodes, and it was absolutely fantastic. I cannot wait for a chance to run another version of it myself. So we're going to talk about how we made it, what it was all about. Spoilers, it involves Disney World. And basically just do a post-mortem of what we put together, how it worked, why, and ultimately how it went. Does that sound fun, Gabe?
Yeah, sounds good to me.
All right, fantastic. So first off, let's start with what setting this was in. Now, it was the setting called Radiant Earth. Now, if you haven't heard of Radiant Earth, that's probably because Gabe created it. Gabe, what's Radiant Earth?
All right, Radiant Earth is, in essence, a combination of 2 franchises that I love a lot and wanted to incorporate somehow into D&D. Those franchises being Adventure Time and Fallout. Now, for those of you not aware of what Adventure Time is, it's a zany Cartoon Network show involving a magical land called Ooo, and it stars a boy named Finn, who is a normal human, and his talking magical dog that can stretch and stuff. Well, the interesting thing about the setting is that Ooo is this fantastically weird land, and Finn is the only human in it. But, as you learn over time by watching the series, Ooo is actually Earth after a nuclear war referred to in the lore as the Mushroom War. Now, the weird thing about Ooo is that nobody really knows much about how Earth used to be. There are a couple characters in the show that do, but for the most part, everybody doesn't know Earth, and everybody knows Ooo really well. And then, of course, Fallout, for those of you that don't know, is a post-apocalyptic role-playing game series starring usually vault dwellers, who are people who survived the nuclear war by hiding in vaults, though often the people you're playing are descendants of the original vault dwellers some 100 or 200 years after the war. The Fallout series is more about knowing what the world used to be like, and coming and exploring this post-apocalyptic version of it, where there's lots of horrible shit, there's raiders and monsters and super mutants. So, these 2 settings, they kind of have some similar ideas, but what I really wanted to capture was this kind of post-apocalyptic Earth. Everything's different, and it's all super weird. Like, normal default humans weren't much of a race in this setting. But I initially had the idea to treat it more like Adventure Time, where Finn and Jake don't really know anything about the old world, but they know plenty about their current world. But I think when talking with Dan, I got an idea to kind of change the frame of reference, which made things a lot more in line with how the players did. What did you have to say to me, Dan, on that?
Oh, this was really simple. It was just that whenever you're working on a setting, whenever you're working on an adventure, it's really helpful to have the players and the characters have the same knowledge and the same goals. It's not always possible, but it's helpful to push as much of that direction as possible, because then a lot of the fun parts of the setting come across through gameplay. You discover them through gameplay and exposition that works very well. And in general, as long as your players' motivations and knowledge match your characters' ones, you'll have a more fun projecting yourself into the campaign, and you'll feel more like you're actually experiencing the adventure rather than being sort of removed because you don't actually know the same things. So when the basic structure was presented, it was much more like Adventure Time. The characters in this crazy world all are used to the crazy world, and they know where everything is. The players naturally don't. They show up to an unfamiliar campaign setting. You don't know this stuff. You figure this stuff out by you saying, oh, your character would know that this works this way. And that's a bit removed. Now, on the other hand, if you flip it to be more like Fallout, where the characters all have history books and so on, but most of the actual mass communication networks were destroyed, The players who might be emerging from a vault or something, or just in a cut-off piece of area, might not know anything about what Earth currently is, other than their direct immediate area. They just know that weird stuff's going on. But they might know a lot about what Earth was, because of the libraries that existed, and so on. So that way, the players and the characters would have similar information, and as the players discovered and investigated the world, their characters would too, and they would learn together, which would put them a lot closer to each other. It's a lot more fun to find out what's happening in Washington, D.C., through this fun lens, which ended up being like, imagine the current world. Now there's some sort of crazy, zany magic happens, and you get a colorful, ridiculous, post-apocalyptic current world. So,
Indeed.
A great example of that, I think, was the Abraham Lincoln statue in Washington, D.C. So, you've got Abraham Lincoln statue.
Yes.
It's a big thing that looms in the player's mind, and then something happens. What was that something?
Well, so, one of the races in this world that I created, where magic is unleashed by a nuclear war, is just a race of living statues that were animated by the ambient magical energy. So what better to have as an example of one of these than the big statue of Abraham Lincoln from the Lincoln Memorial? Now, one might imagine that if you animated the statue of Abraham Lincoln, you would end up with a sort of just and kind ruler who's all about freedom and democracy. But no, he's a tyrant, a complete dictator. He doesn't have Abraham Lincoln's memories or personality. He's just a giant stone statue man that is now the brutal dictator of a country he calls Columbia that's made in the ruins of the area around D.C. And there's tons of other, like, silly examples I came up with, like, based on Fallout New Vegas, where there's the gang, the Kings, in New Vegas ruins, who are a bunch of people who think that Elvis Presley was some kind of godlike figure that everybody aspired to be because they found all these documents in a school of impression. I decided, why not take that to its even more unlogical extreme and make it a religious autocracy worshipping Elvis Presley as a god and brutally conquering the ruins of the Mojave.
So, like, this is a great example of why Radiant Earth just sounds so fun, because the setting is ridiculous and over the top and fun. It's familiar but different, which is one of the most positive things that a player can experience. That players want comfort at first, so that you give them that familiarity, and then once you're comfortable, you want variety and difference, and so you get this added immersion to all this, playing in a world that you're familiar with, but it's all crazy and weird, and you're getting to feel fresh and new at the same time. So it's a really fun setting. It's obviously, there's a huge potential to create these interesting organizations, these fun, absurd constructs you wouldn't get elsewhere, and it's like everything's a writing prompt. You don't need to create anything out of whole cloth. You just think, what would California be like? What would Washington, D.C. be like? What would Russia be like? What could it be like? You have all this stuff to work with and to try to turn to its crazy extremes. So that's what I think was real fun of Radiant Earth, that connection of you, the player, and you, the character, don't really know what the rest of the world is like, and as you explore, you discover the craziness for yourself. It's more fun to find out that Abraham Lincoln is a giant animated statue by hearing the footsteps come along the abandoned walkways and see him coming to you, rather than just rolling a history check and finding out that information. So, that's the setting with Radiant Earth. Now, when you came, you had put your players in the swamp, right?
Well, sort of. To kind of typify this exploring and discovering the new world, I put my players in an isolated part of the ruins of the United States. In this case, I used southern Florida, with the excuse that the middle of Florida was completely overtaken by swamp in the aftermath of the war and bombs, and that it was just this horrible, horrible place known as the Death Swamp. Nobody called it the Everglades anymore. It was just this place of death, decay, and destruction that everybody was afraid of, right? It's just this horrible, horrible place. And my players know that if they're going to get out of southern Florida, they have to go through it. So the whole early part of the campaign is them exploring southern Florida, only to know that eventually they're going to have to make it through this horrible, deadly place.
Okay, that's really fun foreshadowing, too. It's like, you have a reason to close them off, and this sort of metaphorical thing for the larger world. This works really well for... I know you don't enjoy the gameplay of this, but this works really well for example, Breath of the Wild, Zelda, that you're on this big plateau, and there's these cliffs that you can't get down, and when you finally get a chance to get down them, you're like, oh, cool, like, now the whole world's open to me, which is this really powerful moment. And I think that creating a really dangerous swamp is actually an even cooler version of that, because you can just feel it hemming it in and knowing that you're going to have to get strong enough to get past that. So when you came to me and said, let's collaborate, what's going on, your characters were moving towards the swamp, and the idea would be that we would launch our mini-campaign when they were going to go through it. And at that point, looking at Radiant Earth, we were looking for ideas, and we were thinking, okay, so what cool stuff could happen around there? And I thought about it, and I immediately said, so have they been to Disney World yet?
And my thought to that was, well, I'd already kind of considered having the ruins of Disney World be a part of their adventure through the swamp, but I know my players are big fans of Disney, and Dan brings up a good point that Disney World offers all kinds of ripe opportunities to have fun in this kind of magical post-apoc setting. And I said, well, what if the danger is Disney World?
And that is what it made amazing. So basically that was this click moment of, so we have a cool idea, we look at the setting for inspiration, Disney World is this fun thing that looms in players' minds, and Gabe came up with the idea, I believe. We're going to quickly lose track. At the beginning, it's easy to remember who came up with what, but after we get a little bit deeper, we're going to totally lose track of who said what.
Oh, yeah.
But at the start, I believe that Gabe, it was your idea to say, so yeah, what if the danger was Disney World? What if that's what's causing the swamp to be so scary?
Yeah. So what would we do to Disney World to make the so-called happiest place on Earth the source of all death and despair within this massive swamp?
Yes, and so with looking for that, we started looking for inspiration, and I remembered something that I had seen years ago when Warren Spector, the creator of the famous Deus Ex video games, said after a while that he was tired of making games about guys in black leather jackets carrying guns. And so he decided to work on a game for Disney. And the idea was really cool. It was this thing called Epic Mickey. And the idea was that Mickey goes to this sort of forgotten this land where all the forgotten Disney cartoons go to dwell and be forgotten. And the whole thing is in disrepair because he messed it up. And it's all like melting away, and it's very dark, and if the early concept images are so cool, like you see all these sort of dark Disney designs and like an animatronic goofy skeleton that's crumbling, and it's like this mix of, Disney and horror in this really cool way. And it was super exciting. People got really crazy excited about it. The ideas of making creativity and morality baked into the mechanics of the game was really interesting, and it came out and it was really disappointing. It was not good, not a good game at all. It wasn't terrible, it just did not by any means deliver on what we were expecting. And that's one of my favorite wells of inspiration, when I get really excited about what I think something is going to be, and then when it's not, well, make your own thing that is that thing. And so I remember showing you some of the concept art, and I believe that kicked off a lot of this really cool inspiration for both of us.
Yeah, so the concept art that particularly struck me was this old image of a completely disturbing-looking automaton from Disney, like those kind of animatronics that they employ in a lot of parts of the park. But it was like oily and rusted and ruined. And it was scary. It evokes an image of fear.
Yes.
And that fearful image of this disturbed animatronic kind of served as the basis for this thing that we decided to call the Rot. Dan, what was the Rot?
Well, basically, when we were looking at the Rot, we were trying to come up with the core themes of the game, and we didn't really know what they were going to be yet, and so we were sort of exploring and figuring out what's going on. But if you want to make a powerful campaign, and I've talked about this before a lot, building Raven Shadow and so on, you want to figure out what themes you want your gameplay to evoke so that it means more than just being an excuse to fight monsters sitting around a table. And that's how you create a more powerful, lasting piece of work. So we're going to get into more about how we got that more specifically later, but the core concept was something bad is happening to Disneyland, right? So what exactly is that? And so we came up with the idea of this concept of the rot, that for some reason things were getting really bad, that things were getting corrupted. Some of the characters that used to exist in the park that would have come to life now have gone insane. We had to answer a lot of questions about, like, so are the characters alive? Is there a Peter Pan? Is there a Captain Hook? Or is it just people that are... Maybe the whole Disneyland is just the people in the park that are wearing the costumes have become possessed by the costumes. And so they believe they're Cinderella or Captain Hook, but they're not really. And so we went through a lot of questions like that, and we ultimately decided, you know what, the most fun version of this is to kind of do it like Kingdom Hearts, where you're dealing with the actual characters just in a brand new, unfamiliar setting, which is much more in the Radiant Earth style. We easily could have done, like, the spirit, people who are wearing, like, the Peter Pan suit, you know, the characters that were employed at Disneyland. People dressed in those costumes think they're Peter Pan and so on. But isn't it more fun to actually meet Peter Pan? Isn't it more fun to actually meet Captain Hook brought to life? And so when we went through that, it says, okay, those characters all exist. They all came to life. That's cool. Now things have gone bad. Now this rot is seeping out of Disneyland and infecting the swamp. And the thing that people think are zombies are actually these characters that have been stripped down to their animatronic selves and have lost all sanity and are acting like robot zombies.
Yeah, and it creates this very striking image, right, of having a familiar and beloved character turned into this horrifying animatronic monstrosity. It evokes the very same element of fear that something like Five Nights at Freddy's does, where you have these old school animatronics in just this frightful scenario. But another concept we wanted to have was that the players needed to be able to save Disney, and it kind of gets into our core theme for this game, which was that at the end of the day, creativity is a spark of joy that can bring something good back to even the darkest places. And to that end, we created a mechanic and an idea for something to oppose the rot, a way which the players could take to restore Disney World to this happy, magical place. And this concept was very simply dubbed joy. Joy is the amount of happiness that the players have brought back to Disney World. At the start of the game, obviously, the joy level of Disney World is incredibly low. The rot is winning, and the villains are in control of most of the park, which we'll get to in a little bit as we explore how we built up the park. But the joy not only has a notable effect on the characters of the world, that as the players bring more joy to the park, the non-villain characters get happier, but will actually notably bring the park back into running order. For example, very early on, when the players agreed to help a character, that character's increased happiness at knowing that someone was finally there to help them caused some of the peeling paint on one of the buildings to unpeel and kind of heal over. So we introduced this powerful concept of healing through happiness, which to us seemed really core to the idea of a Disney World sort of place.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was super important because we knew that we wanted the theme to be that Disney World starts in a terrible, terrible place. At the end of the campaign, the players have either destroyed the threat that it represents, or preferably have gone above and beyond and restored happiness and ended the rot forever. And now that Disneyland is a place of joy and beauty again, rather than a place of danger and despair. So those were the two major ending points. They could either destroy the problem, or they could fix the problem and bring it back. Now, what we wanted to do, though, is another thing is, I mentioned that you want your characters and your players to have similar knowledge and similar motivations. And to that reason, we wanted players to have an incentive to be heroic, an incentive to care about the themes of joy and despair, because the rot is driven by despair. And we'll get to the actual core in-setting world version of exactly what's causing it later. But the rot's driven by despair, and joy is what opposes that. Joy and hope and creative treasure of that world. So we wanted to manifest mechanically and be relevant to the players, so that if players wanted to oppose the rot and to accomplish their goals, they should bring joy to the world. They should try to help the characters and defeat villains, help people who were imprisoned, drive away, protect people who were afraid, anything they could to help the people and the innocents of Disney World, the good characters, they should do. And doing so would have tangible impact on the campaign. Certain parts of the park would start working again. Magical items that were, like, for example, you might have something like Peter Pan's shoes that wouldn't work because there wasn't enough joy left. But once there was more joy brought back to the park, when some of the villains were defeated and some people were saved, they might start working again. So players might get these cool, like, iconic magical items from Disneyland, and be able to make them work again only once they had brought some more joy back. And that was a really fun concept that we really, really liked. And that's, like, I remember from the beginning we said, well, maybe we can give them Aladdin's lamp, but the joy has to be max. They can only make one wish if they make the park fully perfect again. That sort of thing.
Yeah, and so with this kind of joy concept and this core conflict between the joy and the rot, this reasoning for the players to interact with the world and make it better, giving them tangible rewards, we now needed to build out what is the core setting structure. Why is the park this way? What is happening here? So the first idea we had to build out the map, and the idea we went with, because it just was so basic, was to take the map of Disney World and break it into the zones, because Disney World is composed of several parks. And then we gave each park to a Disney villain.
Yes, indeed. So, basically, like what Gabe just said, we're going to be off Radiant Earth, right? So, it's the real world. So, there's already a map of Disney World. Let's figure out how to make it useful. Let's make our own zone the same map. So that way players could also Google the map of Disney World. And we actually ended up coming to the setting with one that we gave them. And they could use a real map of Disney World and their own memories of, because I know like some of our players, like Chad, had actually been to Disney World before. And they knew how the park worked. And we would try to use as much of the park's information as we could. So, for example, there were several different parks called, like, the Magic Kingdom, Epcot, Downtown Disney, Typhoon Lagoon, Disney's Boardwalk, Disney MGM Studios, and Disney's Animal Kingdom, Blizzard Beach, that sort of thing. So we decided to focus on only a few of them. We avoided the ones that are more like just hotel sections or things like that. But we took every major park, the Animal Kingdom, the Boardwalk, Epcot, MGM Studios, and Downtown Disney, I believe, and we decided, I think maybe Typhoon Lagoon too, and the Magic Kingdom, and we decided to make each one a major zone that was, like we've talked about with Lore Dungeons, shaped around the personality of a villain that controlled them. That was our major idea. And the way it would be set up was, the first adventure would be about getting into the park, the next adventures would be about going through these sort of basic lower-level kingdoms and areas, and dealing with the characters who were in control of them now, and explore how they had changed. And then finally, they would make their way to the Magic Kingdom, which was the big finale, and deal with something there. The big final villain battle, climactic, solve the problem somehow, would happen in the Magic Kingdom. That's what we have our basic structure for. And we started looking for a lot of inspiration, right? Like, it wasn't just the map, which, by the way, was really fun to give players and have them realize, oh, this type of stuff's over here, how might that have changed? Oh, this type of stuff's over here, how might that have changed? And give them an idea of sort of the basic idea of the map, but not know what it looked like in our setting, which was really fun. It made everything feel very real. But anyway, something I was building up to was, we didn't just go off the geography, right? There were other features of the park that we decided to take inspiration from, right?
Yeah, so one of the things people who've been to Disney World might remember is that there's a lot of transit around Disney World. There's roads, buses, trains, and this kind of, transportation system around the parks. And there's passes and tickets. We wanted to kind of fit that ticketing and transportation element of the park into this somehow. So what we ended up doing was incorporating the idea of the Magic Band, which in real life is just a band that gives you certain VIP access to things in the park. But in this world, it gives you access to the Magic Kingdom, which has been sealed off by the main villain of Disney World, which in this case is Maleficent, who has taken over that kind of central castle in the Magic Kingdom. And in this way, we can have that tall castle in the Magic Kingdom looming over the park as this end goal, and make this normally very pretty attraction a evil, towering icon that the players can see and be like, oh, we're going to have to go there.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really, really interesting. And so the ultimate pass to that was the Magic Band. And that became a major plot point for how we would structure things. So one thing that I like to do in open world games is I usually create an intro that's very heavily scripted, where I lay out exactly that players through gameplay will discover what the open world's about, what all the different things they have to do are, and I will tightly control how that information goes through a very linear adventure. Then the adventure opens up into a certain number of sessions where players have a clear objective, but a lot of ways to accomplish that objective. And in this case, the objective was getting magic bands, which were the ultimate, VIP pass of Disney World, in order to get to the Magic Kingdom. And then the finale is again a linear, highly sculpted, really powerful ending. People tend to remember how something starts and how something ends. So those are the sequences you really want to nail. And then you can give them a ton of freedom in the middle, because it all converges on the final ending in terms of what they're doing is the same, but how they do it, how they get their objective is different. So how exactly did we structure these objectives, Gabe?
All right, so we had a very, very basic objective structure. That was the main goal, which was get through the swamp. But the sub-goal became get through Disney World, and then that becomes the main goal of this adventure. So the players can accomplish that in one of two ways, as we've already enumerated. The players can bring joy back to Disney World and give it back to the heroes of Disney, or they can just destroy everything in their path and leave Disney World a rotting mess. But we really wanted to tilt players towards trying to bring the joy back. So as part of structuring this, we set up kind of the main areas of the park. And as I already stated, we decided to give them over to certain villains, but we wanted to give villains in these park areas a good tie to it, or at least have them in areas that reflected that villain very well. Some of these were really easy assignments, like we were like, immediately, yes, this is where they belong. For example, Animal Kingdom got Scar. He's the biggest animal villain in all of Disney that I can think of. I mean, there's others. But when I think of Disney animal villain, the first thing that comes to mind is Scar and his hyena Nazis. So we end up with a very strong theme of some kind of Nazi Animal Kingdom rule by Scar and his hyena police. Then you have the Disney MGM Studios, or as it is now called, Hollywood Studios, since they changed the name, licensing, and all that. We gave over to Gaston. Why? Because Gaston is really popular, and he's one of my favorite Disney villains. He's a number of my players' favorite Disney villains, and Gaston really fits that kind of overly sure of himself kind of persona of Hollywood, of being this very, very self-absorbed person who cares a lot about what others think of him. And so we turned Gaston's Hollywood Studios area into this, like, super superficial world where Gaston is like the worshipped center of it all, and everything is parties and contests, but Gaston always wins all the contests because nobody is willing to invoke his wrath if they defeat him at anything. And parties, just parties, and he's turned the Hollywood Tower Hotel into his giant mansion, and just replaced the ride with rooms, and he's keeping Belle locked in it because, she was his goal in the movies. And then, of course, we had Typhoon Lagoon we handed over to Ursula from The Little Mermaid, because it's a water park and Ursula is an underwater villain. and we kind of increased the flooding in that area so that most of it was underwater, weirdness like that. We didn't expand much on that one because we didn't think the players would spend much time there, and it turns out they spent no time there, so I didn't really feel bad about that. We also gave the downtown Disney area to Cruella de Vil, since it's a shopping area, and Cruella's all about fashion and appearance, so she would obviously be this kind of tycoon and fashion mogul in this evil Disney World. And then, of course, we had the Magic Kingdom assigned to Maleficent, our main villain, Black Dragon, powerful spellcaster. Like, she's everything you want in a powerful D&D villain, right? She's big, powerful, and she's smart, and she has magic. Like, this is someone you should be afraid of.
And it's just like a perfect way to make it feel like D&D again at the end of the day, because the setting is so out there, but like we decided that the finale would feel much more like classic, that her lieutenant would be Jafar, who's this powerful sorcerer, and that she would be also ruling it and be a giant magical dragon, and not the fun kind. So it had this really nice touch. If we had done something weird and had like Gaston be the final villain, it wouldn't have felt as epic or as appropriate tonally. As long as you have your initial tone that's good and your final tone that's good, you have a lot of freedom in the middle just to go nuts.
Yeah, and now, some of you may have noticed that we haven't mentioned one of the parks at all yet, which is Epcot. Well, we didn't give Epcot to any villain. Why? Because neither of us felt a particular attachment to Epcot, and Epcot's long been known as one of the more boring parts of Disney World. It's long needed a rework, and there are some interesting things. Well, that's the thing, Epcot has some serious identity issues that they've been trying to address with newer attractions. I'm sure, we'll get tons of people commenting like, oh, this attraction at Epcot was my favorite attraction in all of Disney World, why are you trashing on Epcot? And to you I say, that's how you feel. It's not how we felt.
Right. Like, there wasn't much identity to Epcot. It was like originally supposed to be like the city of the future, like all that futuristic civilization and stuff, but it's all super dated compared to when it was made and so on. And so it's they rent it out for things, and like the Epcot Center is rented out for weddings and stuff like that. It doesn't have a real strong identity the way that Animal Kingdom or Typhoon Lagoon do. So we decided to we tried coming up with villains to hand it off to. We talked about the villain from The Hunchback of Notre Dame and some other characters, and ultimately though we settled on something that was much, much cooler. The idea that it was a dated city of tomorrow, that it was a future that no longer made sense, that it was outdated and outmoded, made it a very interesting thing for a dumping ground. So we mentioned the Rot before, right? Now, one of the interesting things when you're going through and you're creating this sort of basic idea is, once you have your basic structure, you want to create variety. So the basic structure is, okay, there's a bunch of kingdoms, which are the Disney miniature amusement parks, and each one is run by a powerful villain, and each one, and this is crucial, is not only causing misery in their area, which is destroying the joy of the area, which is something that players would want to stop to restore the park and to gain more power, based on the joy mechanic that we talked about before, that the more joy was in the setting, the more powerful the players got, and the more useful heroic items they could use. But additionally, they needed to take out the villains for a very simple reason. Each of the villains would have a magic band, and a magic band is what would allow a character passage into the final zone where they could actually solve these problems, the Magic Kingdom. If you didn't have a magic band, you could not get into the Magic Kingdom. And so that was our structure. Each villain has a magic band. Each villain's in one of these parks. You're going to have to go to these various parks to get one magic band for each of the players, correct?
Yeah, that was the core idea. But Epcot ended up being our break from that mold. Epcot doesn't have a villainous leader. Epcot doesn't have a magic band in it. Epcot has the Rot Zombies. These horrifying animatronics have all been dumped in Epcot, which has been walled off by the other villains. And to help process all of these dumpings, the Magic Kingdom villainous leadership has employed Captain Hook, captaining a flying version of the Black Pearl, with his good friends Long John Silver and Captain Jack Sparrow, throwing these rot creatures into Epcot. They show up wherever the rot is, and nobody likes it, because Captain Hook, he doesn't work with the other villains. He works for himself for the most part, on the orders of Maleficent, but he has his own goal, because Captain Hook, unlike the other major villains, doesn't have a magic band. And that puts him at odds with the enemies. There was even room at one point for the players maybe working with Captain Hook on a temporary basis, but the players ended up not doing that, which we can get into later.
Yes, indeed. And so this is the thing I really want to touch on is, once you come up with your basic structure, you say, great, now as long as it's not essential to the themes to not have an exception to this, what's the exception? And so if every zone has a villain that has a magic band, a major Disney villain, one zone maybe doesn't have a villain? What makes that scary? What makes that special? And being this sort of horror dumping ground for the rot-affected things will go in there. And so our idea would be that the rot is this disease. It's like a zombie infection that spreads unpredictably. And that because it just starts affecting things in the park, and it's not clear who's going to get affected or why or when, and it does spread somewhat contagiously, though. So once it's found, you need to get rid of those things. Captain Hook would be gather them up, attack anything in it, take those people and a lot of people near them, and throw them into Epcot. And now also, Captain Hook, as you mentioned, does not have a magic band. And so that also is very interesting. I think Cruella de Vil also didn't have one, and she was offering to pay quite a lot for one, right?
Yes, we also did not give one to Cruella de Vil. So it actually ended up that the only outside magic bands were in MGM Studios, Animal Kingdom, Typhoon Lagoon. I actually think we did put a magic band in Epcot, but it wasn't on any villain's hands. It was just this idea that eventually the players might get dumped there by Captain Hook, and they would discover that one of the magic bands had been lost there, and they would be able to steal it.
Right. Oh, no, I remember now. Captain Hook had a magic band, I think, but he didn't have a territory. He really wanted a territory. Yeah. So that was the difference. Cruella de Vil had a territory but didn't have a magic band, and she wanted to be in the Magic Kingdom where all the most fashionable and important things were. Whereas Captain Hook was different because he didn't have an area to call his own. He was constantly attacking other ones and just in his flying ship and trying to take control over them, and while also doing his job for Maleficent in capturing the rot and throwing them away, which is why he was tolerated in attacking those places. And so that way he was special for that reason. And once villains have motivations, you can work with villains, or you can understand how villains might act, and you can understand how to be active. Also, Captain Hook was special for another reason, in that most of the villains were hanging out in their areas, and Captain Hook was a villain who could show up anywhere at any time, and was a very useful narrative device for that reason. We also had another villain a lot like that, didn't we?
Yes, because another one of our favorite Disney villains is Dr. Facilier from The Princess and the Frog. Now, Dr. Facilier may not be among the very classical Disney echelon, but he is a very strong villain in his movie, and he's got this really interesting power set of working with these voodoo demons and shadow spirits. And we wanted to incorporate him into our game as a kind of evil third party. One who's not associated with any of the other villains in the parks, who's kind of playing his own game and playing his own odds. A very untrustworthy figure, but one that the players could work with, though they had to be careful, because Dr. Facilier's deals usually end pretty poorly for anyone who isn't Dr. Facilier.
Yeah, absolutely. And because the players would know about who Dr. Facilier was and be on guard, we wanted to get them to simulate the experience that the characters in the movie originally had, in which they didn't necessarily know that this character was problematic, so we gave him the power to change appearances, so that he would originally appear to be a helpful, lost boy, and he could change different appearances as he showed up, and he would drop a lot of hints and be things like, he would use all his, favorite lines, but in different contexts that wouldn't be as obvious. Like, one of his biggest lines is, "I've got friends on the other side." And so when this character was helping them get into Disney World for his own evil agenda in the first place, so that they might destabilize some things and help him get what he wants, because he really wanted to take over Hades, which we'll get to eventually. He said things like, "Don't worry, I have friends on the other side." And so we kept dropping hints like this until some of the players started to pick up on it, because he wanted them to figure it out. We didn't need this to be a big shock. We wanted them to say, "Wait, is that Facilier?" And it took a little while, and it was very rewarding.
Yeah, that was one of my favorite things of that campaign, was the surprise of, oh, wait, this is Dr. Facilier. Oh. And that was a really fun moment we created. But, yeah, you just brought up Hades, which I think is a very important point that we need to hit. Hades...
Another exception to our basic structure.
Yes. Hades, as the villain in charge of the underworld, is in the Underpark structures and has created his own underworld in Disney. And this acts as a sort of other zone. And Hades himself also has a magic band. But even more importantly, Hades is holding all of the heroes of Disney hostage in his Well of Souls. Which is why there's no heroes in Disney. Well, we haven't mentioned any of the heroes. That's because they're all captured.
Right. Because there's so many Disney heroes, we had to figure out what had been done with them and why they couldn't help. And we considered making them all imprisoned by different villains, but once you have really powerful and character-based NPCs running around, it's like this whole added burden on the DMs to try to figure out what they're doing, how what they're doing helps the player, if it doesn't upstage the players. The players can get really excited about freeing them to see them do cool stuff, but if there's so many of them, it's a problem. So it was really simple just to say, hey, look, they're all in Hades. They're all jailed in Hades. If you want to go do something about that, be my guest. But also, players wouldn't know about Hades early on. And so first they would think they knew what the park was all about. Oh, it's the Disney World Park. But Hades, since it's underground, and it's a secret area, does not show up on the map, and nobody's telling them about it. So that way, it was something we could introduce later in the campaign, after they were very familiar with the setting, to say, ah-ha-ha, there's still more you didn't know about.
Indeed, and it was a great element of the story. But, I think we've hit a good point to drop off, because we've explained the world, we've explained the core ideas of the campaign, why we're working together on it, but we're starting to run a little long, so maybe we should stop this for now, and put the actual story we told in the next podcast.
It's a good idea. I do want to hit one final thing then. Because if anybody following along might be wondering, okay, so how many players are there in your campaign? And how many were there, Gabe?
5.
Right. And if each villain has a magic band, and there's only 4 or 5 zones, that's not much freedom. You can choose which areas you want to tackle them in, but that's a lot of content to go through to get all the magic bands, and you have to hit all of them anyway. So what we decided to do was we gave basically 2 magic bands in most areas. That the major villain and their lieutenant would have a magic band. So that way, players could hit, theoretically, only 2.5 or so, or we'd put one magic band in some of the less scary areas, and so that way players could kind of hit one less scary area and 2 bigger areas, or they could hit larger ones in general. And then we decided, you know what, even that's going to be kind of long. What if we let a magic band let you get 2 people in? And that way it's still really special. It's good for you and a +1. So that way, because it felt weird to say Captain Hook or gets in, he gets a magic band, but his lieutenant also gets a magic band. It doesn't really make the villain special anymore, because they both get their own ones. Oh, by the way, I believe his Jack Sparrow was not helping him out. It was Jack Sparrow's first villain in the Black Pearl, Captain Barbados or whatever.
Oh, you're right. I'm sorry. I accidentally put a hero on the villain side. Sorry. I mean, Jack Sparrow's a really, not a heroic hero. But Captain Captain Barbados or something.
Right. I just remembered that. But so what we did was we tried to get the math to work out, and we said, okay, so the players only need 3 magic bands, because there's 5 of them. And then maybe they could bring in 1 NPC ally if they so chose. So that way they could hit one zone that had two major villains in it, or they could hit, and And they get a third zone, or they get maybe 3 minor zones. They could take out 3 major villains, and all they needed was 3 magic bands. So that was really clear. That way we could spread the magic bands among multiple villains, among multiple parks, and still give the players choices of how they wanted to tackle it. And they got to have this really cool moment where they were going after Gaston's band relatively early, because he seemed like one of the weaker villains. And then they managed to get Captain Hook's band as well when he attacked. And they ended up with this whole treasure trove of cool stuff.
But I think that's something we can expand on in the next episode.
Yes, I'm sorry. Alright, so anyway, that's the overall structure. We're going to Disney World. It's awful. It's the unhappiest place on Earth. And then players have to go adventure through it, pick up these magic bands, and get to the Magic Kingdom, where they can hopefully bring joy back to Disney World or destroy it forever. And from that, as Gabe rightly says, we will continue next time. As always, if you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a 5-star review on iTunes. It's super, super motivating to keep working on it. And also, you can feel free to follow me at Dan Felder, designer Dan F on Twitter. And you can email me if you want. It's also designerdanf@gmail.com, or visit my blog at danfelder.net. Meanwhile, Gabe, do you have any contact information you want to drop, or would you like to remain elusive and mysterious?
I am elusive and I'm elusive and mysterious because my online presence is limited.
All right. So, thanks very much, guys. Hope you enjoy it. Again, 5-star review, and we'll see you next time.